Today we're having a talk on by Myriam Francois-Cerrah on Is Islam a Religion Just for Arabs? So Myriam Francois-Cerrah completed her BA in Social and Political Sciences at Cambridge University in 2003, after which she worked for the Middle Eastern Nonviolence and Democracy Organisation in Jerusalem, where she became skilled in active nonviolence and conflict resolution techniques. In August 2005, she pursued a Master's in Arabic Studies, specialising in Middle East politics at the Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Myriam is an active researcher with the European Muslim Research Centre at Exeter University. She has contributed to reports on topics relating to Islamophobia and European Muslim identity. As a former assistant editor at Mail magazine, she continues to contribute regularly to the magazine. Myriam is of French and Irish heritage. She converted to Islam and became a Muslim in 2003 after extensive research into the religion and its principles. She regularly engages in public debates on a variety of issues relating to politics, modern society, and religion. She has appeared on many popular British political programmes including Newsnight, BBC Radio and the BBC Big Questions, as well as newspapers and magazines such as The Times, The Independent, The London Paper, The Sherwow and many others. She gives talks within the Muslim community and to mainstream institutions like UWI on Islam and Muslim-related topics, especially promoting Islamic awareness. Myriam is currently undertaking a PhD at Oxford University, focusing on Islamic movements in Morocco. She speaks fluent French and proficient Arabic and has travelled extensively. So please warmly welcome Myriam Francois-Cerrah.
Wow, that was an extensive biography. You all know my life story now. That was thanks for that. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you all. Thank you very much for having me. I guess I really need to apologise for the delay and for keeping everyone waiting. Partly my fault, partly the train's fault. Please forgive. So I begin in the name of God, the most merciful, the most kind. I was asked to address the topic of is Islam a religion for Arab men? Actually, was the topic I was going to talk to you about tonight. So we'll expand a little bit if that's okay. And of course it's a slightly humorous title for a number of reasons. Humorous and perhaps tragic in other ways, that we need to discuss the issue in those terms. But it's fairly easy to see why one might assume, after all, if it were the case that Islam were a religion just for Arab men, we might find self-serving religious interpretations extolled by men to justify oppressive practices against women in Muslim-majority countries. Oh, and lo and behold, we do. So it's not complicated to understand why people might come to this conclusion. I hardly need to enumerate the shameful examples of such incidences, from the infantilization of women in countries like Saudi Arabia, through to the limitations placed on full female participation in Iran, through to attempts to justify domestic violence or the harassment of women by so-called scholars. So it's plain to see why many might come to this conclusion. The reality is that the interpretation made of Islam by many men virtually assumes that it's a religion privileging them. The question is, to what extent is that an accurate reflection of the religion, and to what extent is it maybe an accurate reflection of patriarchy, power relations in which men get to define the terms of the discussion? And I would wager that in many developing nations that is indeed the case, that the system in place does not privilege female education, and where it does, the barriers to full female participation in the institutional realm curb the contribution that women could make in order to rebalance it. Although things are progressing. If any of you were following some of the reports that came out for International Women's Day, which was yesterday, you'll have noticed that Qatar came up as the best country to gain an education, I think it was. So in Qatar, women are 6 times more likely than men to gain education. And we have to caveat that admirable result with the fact that there are still significant limitations once women acquire that education in terms of full participation in society. So the question is, how authentic are the interpretations, and to what extent do they reflect socio-political, cultural factors over and above a faithful reading of the text? Islam, the body of ethical and moral principles which are designed to guide humanity to a balanced interaction between one another and the world around us, is to Muslims the path to peace. That's how we understand Islam. And it was indeed revealed to an Arab tribal society in the Hijaz, or modern-day Saudi Arabia, in the 7th century. The language spoken by the people of the region was, and remains, Arabic, and so the revelatory message was transmitted in Arabic. Many of the references in the Quran relate to specific practices of the Arab society of the time. It speaks of the fruits they were familiar with, of the practices they engaged in, and it's spoken in idiom, poetry, allegory, which they were familiar with. So that to an outsider, perhaps, the Quranic message does seem very much tailored to 7th century Arabian society. And it was, for very good reason. It is, to my mind, an erroneous understanding of God's pedagogy to assume that the most effective way to transmit a universal message is to speak in abstract terms. On the contrary, the Quran cannot be considered abstract in any way, to my mind. It doesn't speak in the general platitudes that you'll find in a self-help book in W.H. Smith. In fact, it's here to correct and guide human responses in very specific circumstances, and we are meant from those specific circumstances to extract lessons which account for all the specificities of the framework in which that guidance is being given. So much of the legal prescriptions, for example, are related to a given structure, a societal setup, which, if taken divorced from those parameters, might ultimately end up betraying the universal injunctions underlying the specific prescription. But which, through being revealed in a particular context, does actually provide us with a rich and multi-layered understanding of the necessary conditions surrounding specific injunctions. Now, if that's not abstract, I don't know what is. We'll try and get a little more concrete. So, why was it revealed to the Arabs specifically? To some extent, that's a really lengthy question. We could talk about a lot of things, so I'm going to narrow it down to a few. Partly, this involves tracing the history of the Arab people back to their emergence as the descendants of Ishmael, himself the brother of Ishaq, or Isaac, as Christians would know him, and the son of Abraham, or Ibrahim, peace be upon them all. So that is to say, although 7th century Arabia, at the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had fallen into many polytheistic practices, it had within its culture the remnants of an Abrahamic imprint, which Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had been sent to resurrect and extol. So there's a continuity there, which, if looked into, is really very detailed and interesting. And that is, of course, because Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, from the Islamic perspective, is the last and final messenger of God. But he follows in a long line of messengers and prophets who'd been sent either to affirm previous scriptures or to announce new scripture to people all around the world, really. So whilst the Quran itself explicitly refers to a number of those prophets, Jesus and Moses and Abraham and Noah, peace be upon them all, it also suggests that others that are not mentioned were also sent. And the discerning eye can usually notice the imprint of divine wisdom in all major civilizations and cultures, from China to India, regardless of what Muslims would consider to be accretions which have crept into the human transmission of those messages. But in the case of the Hijaz of Arabia, that imprint was very tangible, and a number of signs pointed to it in the years even prior to Muhammad, peace be upon him's birth. there is, of course, the incident of the elephant, which is quite a famous incident because it helps to determine the year in which Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born. And it's a fascinating incident. Abraha, who was a ruler in neighbouring Sana'a, so modern-day Yemen, had been insulted by the behaviour of somebody who'd come and behaved inappropriately in his land, and decided that he was going to invade the Hijaz, and he was going to destroy the Kaaba, which was a prized possession of the Arabs. And he decided he would do so by taking elephants with him, because the elephants were absolutely terrifying to the Arabs. They'd never seen elephants before, and this was going to be an amazing technique. The problem was that when he arrived with the elephants, he didn't realise that all nature, of course, is by its nature Muslim in the sense of submitted to God, and therefore answers to God. And so when he directed the elephant towards the Kaaba, the elephant would kneel down and refuse to go forward, and they would beat it and it just wouldn't proceed on towards the Kaaba. They would turn it around and it would diligently move in the direction it had been told, but when they tried to face it towards the Kaaba in view of its destruction, the elephant refused. And this was one of the many incidents that precede the birth of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and that point to some sort of a precedent, a divine precedent in the region. Another example would be, of course, that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him's grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, had discovered, or rediscovered, we should say, the well of Zamzam. Now we know, or many of you will be aware, that the well of Zamzam wasn't discovered by Abdul Muttalib. It, of course, has a history that harks much further back. But of course this happens just in his grandfather's lifetime. He has a dream, and we rediscover the well. And if you think of the rediscovery of the well almost as an allegory for the rediscovery of the Abrahamic faith, so that the rediscovery of water, so very essential in the desert, is itself a reminder of this return of the source, the return of the original message which had come to quench a parched polytheistic Arabia. So describing the Prophet, peace be upon him, God tells us, "And we have not sent you except as a mercy to mankind." So of course from the Muslim perspective, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is not sent to the Arabs for the Arabs. He is sent to the Arabs in order to teach them lessons in a given context which have then got universal resonance. And speaking of the ancestry we were talking about, the Kaaba itself, many of you will be aware that the Kaaba was not created by Muhammad, peace be upon him. Rather, the Kaaba was established by Abraham, and Muslims believe that the black stone that's contained within it was sent from heaven by God to Adam and Eve. In that sense, we're again harking back towards a tradition which suggests that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is coming with a strong lineage, and we'll get to the issue of lineage, which I think is also very important. So of course the Kaaba, when it had originally been established by Abraham, was a centre of monotheistic worship. The polytheism gradually creeps in, I think, the very human tendency that we have to focus on the specifics, sometimes neglecting the whole, so that focusing on specific attributes, we sometimes forget to take a step back and see the bigger picture. And to some extent, that's what a lot of polytheism is. It's focusing on single attributes, but failing to see the broader picture within which those attributes fit. So, when Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born into this Arabian society, there's a substantial historical legacy of prophets, of revelation. They exist. There's knowledge of this in society, regardless of the accretions of polytheism which had appeared in people's practices. And so in that sense, it is worth remembering that prophets are not sent to forge totally new norms in society, but rather they're individuals with what we might call an innate sensibility, which makes them most apt at recognising the divine norms present in nature and the world around them. And actually, the connection to nature is something that I have a particular interest in, but we can't go into too much today. But it does seem to me that we neglect the extent to which the connection to nature and animals is a divine window of understanding particularly since, as Muslims, we consider that the universe is the Kitab al-Manshur, or the displayed book, and that displayed book, in other words, the universe, comes to confirm and support the truth of revelation, or al-Kitab al-Mastur, of the written book. So the idea being that the longer you spend in nature, the more time you spend in the environment, the more you'll find an affirmation of the truths that you might find in Revelation. So we were talking a little bit about lineage and genealogy, and of course we've spoken a little bit about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him's genealogy, the Arab genealogy. And this is important because Arabian society had a very strong attachment to genealogy. The Arabs prided themselves on their lineage, on who they were related to. And so if you wanted to send a message to a people who might have some cognizance of the historical baggage upon which they were stood, the Arabs seem like a fitting peoples. They have a strong attachment to lineage. They also have this Abrahamic tradition, which they are keen to retain as part of that connection. And of course, the specific tribe that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is born into, the tribe of the Quraysh, is a tribe which had taken over the administration of Mecca and of the Kaaba, and this afforded them a certain status and respect within broader society. And actually, on the topic of tribal society, this is another really interesting insight. Tribal society is, by its very nature, anti-individualistic. You don't exist as a unit in a tribal society. You can't be persecuted as a unit or attacked as an individual without there being broader societal repercussions, including the potential destabilization of the region and potentially war. So if you wanted to send somebody and protect them through the natural setup of the society, tribal society is one in which you can't attack lone individuals without risking incurring the wrath of the entire tribe. And that was something people avoided at all costs. Stability, pacts through marriage, pacts through business, were the way in which people solidified their links, and they avoided anything that could run counter to that. So the tribal nature of the society in itself carries certain elements which seem to indicate a worth, if you like, in supporting the message of revelation. But it's also interesting that tribal society, by its nature, also was lacking a unity of purpose and action, which had hampered the Arabs from uniting and developing as a kind of holistic civilization. And it really is a testament to the message that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, brought, that in this profound state of disunity and near constant conflict, although there were obviously strong attempts to avoid it, the message that he brought led to lasting unity of purpose, established a common identity, a common culture. There's an Iranian sociologist and thinker, Ali Shariati, who's got a very interesting theory in response to this very question of why the Arabs. He personally holds that there are various factors within a society which affect its destiny, including things like the personality of individuals. One of them is accident, norms, and people. And he regards the people, which he calls it al-nas, which means people in Arabic, but he defines it as the will of the mass of the people. And the norm, the scientifically demonstrable laws existent in the society, as being the two most important aspects in shaping that society. So of each of these on a society, so that a society in which the mass of people are very educated and culturally advanced is one where the importance of personality diminishes. He's obviously been reading Weber. And of course the personality, the importance of personality becomes less important. But in societies where that is not the case, the importance of personality then becomes primordial, and that is very much the case in a tribal society, in clan-based societies. And we see this, so that in Arabian society, the Arabs used to give one another nicknames, and nicknames on the basis of what? On the basis of their reputation, on the basis of attributes, personal attributes, which were prized. We know that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was known as Al-Amin, the trustworthy, that his wife, Khadija, may Allah be pleased with her, was known as At-Tahira, the pure one, and so on and so forth. It was a very common practice in the society. And so the aspect of personality was absolutely central to the society, and it meant that if somebody developed a particularly good personality, not only was that recognized in the attribution of a nickname, if you like, but it also meant that they became praised on that basis. And with praise comes emulation. Who are the praised people in our society? They're the ones we put on TV screens and give awards to, or the equivalent, if you like, of our role models. And so if you wanted to create a role model whose influence could be significant on the society around him, you might yet again choose a society in which personality was very much privileged, and I think that's what we find yet again in that particular society. Geographically, also, Arabia is very interesting. It's cocooned by natural barriers. It's flanked, I haven't got a map, but it's flanked by the Red Sea to the west, the Persian Gulf to the east, and it's cut off from its northern neighbours and southern neighbours by large expanses of desert. And many scholars have pondered on the impact the desert had on Hijazi culture, and on the types of values that it fostered in people: courage and chivalry, generosity, all really important values in that sort of environment where you depended on these for basic survival. And it's worth bearing in mind that the cultivation of those values is something that Islam doesn't come to supplement. On the contrary, it affirms those values and helps to refine areas where there may have been a deviance from the original Abrahamic message. And in this, Shariati has a particularly poetic description that I'd love to share with you. He said, he, being Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, appeared in a particular geographical location, the Arabian Peninsula, which, from the point of view of civilization, was just like its geographical position. That is, it was a peninsula surrounded on three sides by seas, but thirsting and deprived of water. It was a neighbour to the great civilizations of history. To the north, the civilization of Greece and Byzantine. To the east, the civilization of Iran. To the southeast, the civilization of India. To the northwest, the Aramaic Hebrew civilization. It was also a neighbour to the religions of Moses, of Jesus, of Zoroaster, as well as the totality of Aryan and Semitic civilizations. At the time of the appearance of the Prophet of Islam, all the civilizations in existence were gathered around the Arabian Peninsula, but the peculiar geographical location of the peninsula decreed that just as none of the vapours that arose over the oceans ever reached the peninsula, so too not a trace of the surrounding civilizations ever penetrated the peninsula. So I think I like the analogy with the sea, of course, and culture. And of course, Shariati is not alone in stressing the geographical surroundings as having an impact on the conditions which would make people more or less receptive to divine wisdom, more or less willing or able to see its values independently of the influence of those great civilizations that were bordering it. But what Shariati also notes is that historians looking at the region would have to conclude that it was in fact the personality of this very individual which would lead to the momentous changes and developments which subsequently occurred. That the development of a civilization and of a lofty new culture had to be located in something of this individual's ability to carry those divine values forth. And of course, this impacted greatly the society around him. One of the other points that I'm going to touch on is the oral tradition. Of course, the Arabs had a very strong oral tradition. They memorized huge and vast amounts. The commitment to poetry was one of the most prized possessions anybody could have. To be a great poet was to be a modern-day celebrity, if you like. It was somebody who had respect, admiration, skill. And so, to some extent, if you wanted to really impress the Arabs and impress a message upon the Arabs also, it would be a fitting environment to have a society in which oral traditions were so well preserved, and a society in which poetry and oratory was so well respected. That meant if you sent a message of divine revelation, this was a very receptive environment for it to come into. So why then does the Quran sometimes speak to specific instances in Arab society, then offer more general precepts? That's one of the questions I sometimes get asked. Well, the Quran was revealed in response to given situations as a means of clarifying the best means of apprehending that given situation. Again, it's not a book of abstract moral principles, but rather, when read in reference to the context of revelation, it offers us insight into how God would want us to apprehend that given situation. And from that, we extract the broad universal principles which then need to be applied in individual specific contexts. The fact that revelation responds to particular situations, which just so happen to be occurring in 7th century Arabia, and they had to occur at some point in history, is just a means of offering a uniquely detailed and nuanced understanding of God's commands, since every aspect of the context, from the individuals involved, their social status, the actions, the impact of their actions on others, the details of the case, all offer profound insight into the divine injunction. And in that sense, to me, that's a far richer way of conveying understanding than broad precepts, which could be interpreted in 10 million ways, and we already interpret these ones in many different ways. So you can imagine the confusion where it's too broad. Now, flowing from this idea, to what extent does authentic Islam therefore seek to replicate a 7th century Arabian mode of human existence? Well, the answer is that the application of divine principles and guidance to 7th century Arabia is a contextualized and detailed understanding, but it's of transformative potential, of transformative divine values, which then need to be applied to different societies. The key is not to seek to blindly replicate 7th century Arabian conditions, but to remain true to the spirit of the message, extract the regenerative potential of the message, to apply it to benefit our societies and to help them to develop to the highest ethical standards. That's the objective. And that's what the early Muslim societies did. As Islam spread into different nations and continents, it didn't divorce people from their cultures or their traditions, but rather it helped purify unethical practices and absorb the richness of those different cultures. And in doing so, that really contributed to developing the body of Islamic civilization and helped for it to flourish, really. So the idea is that those ethical ideals then become applied in different contexts in different ways. And an easy way to think of it is to look at, for example, the institutions of prayer. So something like a mosque. Architectural diversity, to some extent, reflects cultural diversity. We have mosques in China today, which very much fit in with broader Chinese architectural designs. Many of them don't have minarets, and they also, to some extent, reflect cultural practices, so that we have all-women mosques in China. I've not heard of all-women mosques in many other countries. That reflects the cultural practices of that country, while sticking to the original message, which is creating centres of worship. So, in many ways, the message of Islam actually came to minimize the preeminence of Arab identity. It came to rid them of the idea of clan as being the primordial basis upon which people united, and sought instead to unite them on the basis of ethical values. That's what people were supposed to unite around. Commitment to God, commitment to spreading His values on earth were what united people, rather than clan, lineage, or tribe. It was piety, compassion, generosity, which were to supplant Arab identity in terms of defining, in terms of the defining position in people's identity, but without erasing it. It's not about erasing the identity. So the message that Muhammad, peace be upon him, brought was one of fundamental equality of all human beings, but they were place social hierarchy based on ethnicity, based on clan, based on gender. And he did this himself through creating very concrete examples, very concrete manifestations of the ideals that he was seeking to create. So, for example, he married Zainab, who was, may Allah be pleased with her, who was of an aristocratic background, to Zayd, who was a former slave. This was contrary to the norms of the society. It was considered particularly controversial and bizarre. People married within their own social status, but it was part of affirming this message of fundamental human equality. He also did it by appointing women to positions of authority. When he first set up the society in Medina, one of the first things he did was appoint a woman to regulate the marketplace. And of course, we know from his farewell sermon that this affirmation of fundamental equality was central to his message. A lot of the core points that of the message that he was bringing were reaffirmed in that farewell address, and they included the idea that all humans, all mankind is from Adam and Eve. No Arab has any superiority over a non-Arab. Non-Arab has superiority over an Arab. No white over a black person, no black over a white person, and the only defining aspects between human beings are piety and good actions. Which actually brings us quite nicely to the second part of the question, if you like, which is Islam a religion for Arab men, if I could put the focus on the men part now, implying, of course, that it favours men and discriminates against women. Now again, if we based ourselves on the example of the practitioners of the faith, it might be difficult to argue otherwise. Hamza Yusuf Hanson likes to say, it's the 98% of men who give us 2% of men a bad name. The reality, or the theory at least, far removed, be it from what it should be, is that men and women are equal partners who were both created for the very same purpose, that is to worship God. That is why all human beings were created. In that sense, Islam came for the emancipation of all human beings. It wasn't a gendered religion. It came to affirm their essential equality and, again, defining the only aspects which could differentiate us through values which were equally accessible to men or women. Piety and good deeds are not gender-based. Anybody can accede to them. A man or a woman who is more pious and has more good deeds is the better of the two, regardless of gender or anything else. So the Quranic model of gender relations is actually one of cooperation and mutual help in the path of God. That is, supporting one another in doing good deeds. That's why we're here, to do good deeds, and we're created as partners to help one another achieve that. It does seem that all too often, some men think women are created to support them in order that they may flourish to their full capacity. Convenient home helps there to oil the machine of daily life while men get on with chasing their dreams. That's not the model. That may be the reality, but it's not the model. As God's vicegerents on earth, which is what all human beings are, men and women have an equal responsibility to carry and reflect divine values. And this is manifested in possibly different ways. There are some minor differences between us. To be absolutely fair would be to reflect those minor differences in our treatment where we may want it. Sometimes, actually, blind application of equality ends up being very unfair. There's a lot of theorizing on this. Unlike the biblical story, for example, the Quran doesn't mention woman being created for Adam. She's not a derivative of the male by virtue of being from his rib or such like. Rather, the Quran mentions that men and women are protective friends of one another. They are, to quote the Quran, they are a garment for you and you are a garment for them. A garment does what? A garment shields you from adverse elements. It beautifies you. It covers up your faults and your flaws. And you're a garment to one another. And so we find ourselves back to this idea of protecting friendship, a concept which is very far removed from the desire to impose your will on one another or to be the dominant force. Supporting one another in achieving our God-given potential is what the real notion of being a Muslim in a Muslim relationship is truly about. So the relationship is not meant to be rivalry. It's not meant to be conflictual. It's all about cooperation and mutual support in God's way. The Quran tells us, in fact, and I quote, "The believers, male and female, are the allies of one another." Now, the concept of allies itself suggests an equal pairing and an equal responsibility to look after one another, with no hierarchy implied, in fact, therein. And in fact, we are protectors of one another, and the verse continues, "And they enjoin good and forbid evil, and keep up prayer and pay zakat." So we protect one another in order to do what? To advance those that good, to forbid evil, to keep up prayer, God consciousness. Ooh, pardon me. So, to quote another verse, in fact, "And among his signs is the fact that he has created spouses for you from among yourselves, so that you may dwell in tranquility with them. And he has planted love and mercy between you, and in that are signs for people who reflect." And wouldn't it be great if we did? However, how often do we truly reflect on the fact that what is supposed to be the defining characteristics of the relationship between a man and a woman is supposed to be love and mercy? That's how we're supposed to interact with one another. And that involves seeking to achieve that state of tranquility. It involves effort, it involves work on both sides. Now, the Quran itself speaks about women in general and specific terms. It doesn't associate womanhood with inferiority or deficiency of any sort. There's no primordial sin, there's no disposition to sin that's not also found in men, for that matter. Pharaoh's wife is praised for her spiritual insight and her moral courage in refusing to be intimidated by her husband's arrogance and evil. Myriam, peace be upon her, is an example of perfect faith and piety. She suffers what's decreed of her of the slanders of people without any diminution of her trust in God. And the Queen of Sheba, who's a very interesting example, is referred to as a model of wise political leadership, of intellectual curiosity, of spiritual insight. So in these portrayals, really, we're moving beyond the caricatured and one-dimensional view of women as walking rooms or walking rooms with a broom. When we do see women negatively portrayed, it's usually in the examples, for example, of the wife of Lut or Nuh. It's nothing to do with their femininity. It's everything to do with their actions. In other words, when women are condemned in the Quran, they're condemned on the same basis that a man would be, because they're betraying morals. So, and if we needed even more clarity on the issue, the Prophet, peace be upon him, stated, "Certainly women are the equals of men. Whoever honours them is honourable, and whomever disdains them is worthy of disdain." So women were involved in all levels of public life. When the Prophet, peace be upon him, preached, he included them in the discussions. He consulted them, in fact. And the example of the Prophet, peace be upon him's wife, Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, is a reminder of the role that women did play in all spheres of life. Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, the mother of the believers, that's to the Islamic heritage, and her actions and life really contrast very starkly with the meek model that many propound today. And in the name of Islam, of course, she defended the right to education, to social and political action, and in many ways, in order to be able to counter a lot of the negative views, we need to become a living model of the values that she advocated, that she embodied. Most people know that she was a very well-respected scholar who taught scores of men and women, and whose knowledge of Islam was really second to none. Whenever the companions had any questions over the religion, they would consult her. And the Prophet even said, peace be upon him, that you can obtain half of your religion from her. In fact, in the hadith, it's recounted that when the Prophet, peace be upon him, had to leave Medina, he told Muslims to consult her over any religious problems in his absence. In other words, he placed authority in whom when he left? In a woman. There was no issue with that then. The greatest companions, in fact, used to consult her and ask her and find that she was very knowledgeable in all areas. The teacher of Imam Malik, Imam al-Zuhri, said of her, "The knowledge of Aisha was greater than that of all the companions. She had a school in Medina, and people used to come and ask her about all manners of topics. In fact, this was one of her defining characteristics. She really had knowledge in so many areas, in science, in maths, in poetry, in medicine, and of course in religious studies, I guess we'd call it today. In addition, she was known to be particularly eloquent, with an unparalleled mastery of the Arabic language. In fact, one saying recounts, "I heard the speech of Abu Bakr, of Umar, of Uthman, of Ali, but I never heard a speech better than that of Aisha." And according to Abu Abdullah al-Ghafiqi, she has the most transmissions and the most jurisprudence of those who gave fatwa or rulings. She was sought out by people from the furthest lands for her knowledge of the Sunnah, or what is required, and she was wonderful in tafsir, in interpretation of the Quran, and eloquent in speech. This is the model of femininity carved by Islam as understood by the Prophet, peace be upon him. That's the model. Now, after the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him, she goes on to play a whole host of roles. She becomes a scholar, a stateswoman, a mufti, a judge, a scholar, a principal. She combined spiritualism, activism, knowledge. And this wasn't exclusive to her. There were many other examples that we could also recount. Darda, Fatima bin Qais al-Adawiyya, and others who also, and this is worth pointing out, taught and received knowledge from and to men. In early Islamic history, women, of course, were present in all public meetings and consultations. Their opinions were sought. They were just the same as the men's were. That's another example of the type, to provide another example, in fact, of the type of women that were shaped by the early Islamic community. We can look at Amra bint Abdurrahman, who was a close friend of Aisha's, may Allah be pleased with her. And she gave legal opinions in Medina in the generation after the companions. In fact, she was the foremost authority or scholar. And in the Muwatta by Imam Malik, which is a reference for all scholars really, she is the primary authority on 3 central legal issues. So to those who like to proclaim that women have no place in the working world, she herself reversed the decision of a judge through her greater judicial insight. Her legal opinions were in fact accepted in business transactions and on punishments. In the early medieval period, unlike today in many parts of the world, there were no restrictions on women pursuing studies or gaining jobs. We find in this period women scholars, writers, poets, doctors, teachers, a whole gamut of professions. And from their very first participation in the pledge of Al-Aqaba, which was a momentous political event, a first in many ways for the region. In that event, women were invited to participate fully alongside their male counterparts. There were no distinctions there. Some of the most widely regarded narrations of hadith came from women, and they're actually overrepresented compared to men in the memorization, transmission, and narration of hadiths. Hadiths are the sayings of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. In fact, how many famous scholars whom we actually know a lot about today were actually taught by female teachers? That includes someone like Imam al-Shafi'i, who many of us will know, but how many of us know that he gained most of his knowledge from a female teacher, so much so that when he died, he asked that his funeral procession mark a stop outside the house of the female teacher that he'd been taught by, in order to show how indebted he was in his knowledge to her. We have historical blanks on these issues. The first university in the world was constructed by women. I didn't say the first Islamic university. The first university in the world was constructed by a Muslim woman, Fatima al-Firhi, the Qarawiyyin University in Fez in the 9th century. Al-Azhar was constructed by a woman, Al-Khanzidara. And oh, of course, supreme irony, just a few centuries later we find these institutions banning women from the centres of learning. That isn't to say that we can erase their history completely. We need to go back and dig it up and remember it. It's interesting that the last king of Granada was in fact Aisha al-Hura. So that's the last king of Granada, was Aisha al-Hura. Again, a name missing from our books, but a reminder really of this legacy. In the 15th century, Al-Sakhawi devotes an entire volume of his 12-volume biographical dictionary to female scholars. He lists over 1,000. And more recently, many of you may be familiar with the work of Sheikh Akram Nadwi from Oxford, who himself compiled several tomes in which he listed 8,000 female scholars. And if any of you have got the book, on the front of the book, there's the journey that one of these women took in order to gain her knowledge. And she traveled far and wide. The idea that they were not leaving their house, that, just get the book. So where did it all go wrong is where you're asking, really, I guess. And, to some extent it is a little puzzling. But, well, for one, and I mean, we could talk about this for a while, and I can see some of you are falling asleep. So we'll just talk a little bit about it. But for one, women have, for far too long, been left out of theorizing. That means that they've been theorized about by men who conceive of women, therefore, in relation to themselves and to their function in society. So they think of women in terms of their connection to them, as a daughter, as a wife, as a mother. But they don't express a female perspective, a holistic perspective, which would include a conception of autonomy and purpose. And that in itself is a betrayal, and not necessarily entirely men's fault. They can't theorize as women. We have to do that work. And so, to some extent, you then have tomes dedicated to talking about women's duties and obligations in relation to men, because there were men theorizing about women, and it seemed awfully convenient to write lots of books telling women exactly what they ought to be doing. So rather than continuing, to my mind, the gradual process of liberation which was initiated by the Quran, many jurists then codified the cultural norms of their societies. They accepted customs rather than challenging them in the name of the values of dignity, integrity, autonomy, education, which could have guided the continued assessments of the potentialities for greater continuing female emancipation. But rather than doing that, and this is partly to do with the openness of Islamic jurisprudence on urf, or local custom, because of the openness on urf, it means that when people are, or jurists are theorizing, they take into account the prevailing customs of the society, and this means that a lot of the time the juristic reasoning reflects cultural norms of a particular period. Always does, in fact. And so the dynamic relationship between the text and the culture, which to some extent is a positive one, right? So there's an openness of the text onto the culture, but it can also become a double-edged sword. If the society is highly patriarchal, this will also be reflected in the jurisprudence that will be handed down. And in order to unpick that, we need to unpick those patriarchal readings. We can't assess jurisprudence without assessing the cultural background in which that particular jurisprudence was being developed, and the impact that this was having on people's theorizing. As Tariq Maudud points out, there's no such thing as a neutral cultural sphere. That means the way that we theorize about jurisprudence is also a product of the environment that we live in and the norms and culture, no less than they were at their time. But understanding those norms means that you can then assess to what extent they're influencing the jurisprudence. Now, the consequence of ignoring the cultural context is, to my mind, a literalist reduction and a cultural projection, which then overlooks the principles of Islam in favor of adherence to a tradition which may or may not have strayed from the original ideals. Texts don't speak for themselves. People make texts speak. And unless you understand the people making the text speak, you've not understood the text. Our intellects are forged by our time, our education, our culture, and of course our position within society. So that if we're the big men of our society who get to tell women what to do because that's the accepted cultural norm, we will reflect that in the way that we theorize about women, even though it may not be completely in sync with the original ideals. So that of course means being cognizant of power relations that existed when jurisprudence was being defined. Now, when understanding any divine ruling, we must understand the objective behind it, of course, the essence of the hukum, which can be betrayed if the objective is not maintained in sight when applying it in different contexts, because of course the objective of revealing the Quran in a particular context is to give us details of that context, which then allow us to make a very detailed understanding of the norms that are required to apply it in a very different context. There are norms at that time that are not prevailing today. How do we stay true to the spirit of the injunctions applied in that context if the context today is utterly different? Now, to sum up, before some of you doze off, Islam's message, to my mind, came to a society which had a long precedent of prophets and revelation. In this sense, Islam was sent to affirm the remnants of divine values, affirming the fundamental equality of all humans, distinguished only by piety and good deeds. Any deviance from those ideals is a return to a jahili or an ignorance which predated Islam, and in order to counter it requires a process of reform, a process of digging up the original ideals and bringing them forth, remaining true to them in our current context. On that note, any good that came from today's talk is from Allah, and all errors are my own, and I ask His forgiveness for any